So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism for about the last 20 years or so, but I'm not a Buddhist by training, scholarly. I'm not a scholarly Buddhist, a scholar of Buddhism by training. My background is in social and political philosophy, but over the last 3 or 4 years, thanks to now having tenure, I can start moving my scholarship in the directions that I'm really interested in, and that is trying to bring together Western social and political thought with ideas drawn from the Buddha Dharma. So one area that I'm interested in is an area of reconciliation and conflict resolution. This is a topic that I've been beginning to work on. And if you look at the scholarship on conflict resolution, over the last couple of decades, there's been an interesting movement that's called transformational conflict resolution. So transformative conflict resolution is the view that conflict resolution can be about more than just the ending of hostilities. That with conflict resolution can also become the transformation of people's thoughts and beliefs and feelings. And in fact, among contemporary proponents of transformative conflict resolution, there's actually the argument that in fact, such transformation is a prerequisite of conflict resolution, that particularly in intractable conflicts, so conflicts that have been going on for a very long time, that often involve deeply held beliefs about identity, about religion, about nation or ethnicity, that in fact such long-standing intractable conflicts require a transformation of feeling and thought for those conflicts to really get resolved. So, so this is an area that I've been interested in looking at. And one of the concepts that writers about transformational conflict resolution talk about is the concept of freezing. This is a very interesting idea. And it refers to the ways in which beliefs and viewpoints within conflict situations can become very rigid and unchanging. And this is an obstacle to resolving conflict. And scholars like Daniel Bartel, whose book I've put up there, talk about 3 different kinds of freezing. They talk about cognitive freezing, emotional freezing, and existential freezing. So cognitive freezing, very simply, is the idea that in conflict situations, people's ideas and beliefs about the conflict become very fixed and rigid. And this is a barrier to people beginning to change their minds or look for alternative possibilities. They cling onto certain ideas about the conflict because this is a way to provide a framework for navigating that conflict. It provides a very clear sense of who's our friend, who's our enemy, how do we survive in this conflict situation. Second type of freezing is emotional freezing. And this refers to the idea that in situations of conflict, people's emotional responses can become very frozen and self-reinforcing. So we tend to revert to our very primitive emotional responses of fear, hatred, paranoia, even humiliation in situations of conflict. And this becomes a very big obstacle. We become habituated to those emotional responses, and in fact you can become addicted to hatred and fear, because these provide a kind of security as well, a sense of security. And then the final form of freezing is called existential freezing. There's a very interesting group of scholars within sociology called terror management theory. It's a very interesting group. And the argument here is that the idea of existential freezing is the idea that people in conflict situations hold on to a very strong sense of identity. That in situations where they feel they're at risk of death, and that mortality is close, Studies have shown that people hold on or cling more closely to their sense of personal or group identity, and they emphasize the opposition, what's different from themselves, from the other group. So these are all barriers to resolving conflicts, and they're self-reinforcing. So existential freezing, holding on strongly to a strong sense of self, reinforces emotional freezing, these negative emotional responses of hatred and fear, which reinforces cognitive freezing, holding on to beliefs and ideas about the conflict. So what does this have to do with Buddhism? As Buddhists, I think we all believe that social change, meaningful, enduring social change is not possible without changing hearts and minds, right? That's a core Buddhist principle. And so I think the Buddha Dharma provides some very interesting ways of thinking about these ideas of freezing and how to overcome them. And I very much like this quotation from Dingpa Khyentse Rinpoche, who's one of the great masters of 20th century Tibetan Buddhism. And I just love this quotation, so I'll just read it out to you. Blind to mind's true nature, we hold fast to our thoughts, which are nothing but manifestations of that nature. This freezes awareness into solid concepts, such as I and other, desirable and detestable, and plenty of others. And this is how we create samsara. In the heart of winter, the chill freezes lakes and rivers. As the spring approaches, earth and water warm up and thaw. What then remains of the hardness of the ice? The same applies to our perception of the world around us. What we have to do is melt the ice of concepts into the living water of freedom within. So I feel that this quotation beautifully captures the Buddhist view, which is the nature of reality is not frozen and fixed and rigid, but is much more fluid and ever-changing. And so this idea of a very different perception of reality is captured, I think, very effectively in the Trilaksana, the three marks of existence, right? And these three marks of existence are impermanence, suffering, dukkha, and non-self. So I think that these three concepts are very useful for connecting to the ideas of cognitive, emotional, and existential freedom. So impermanence, of course, we all know that this is a foundation for this concept. The view that the nature of reality is changing and fluid and impermanent, but human beings, through ignorance and self-grasping and self-cherishing, often view the world as fixed and rigid rather than constantly changing. And this is a natural human condition, but as we've seen, it tends to be exaggerated in conflict situations, exacerbated in conflict situations. The second mark of existence is suffering, or dukkha. And this is a very nice quote from Shantideva, from The Way of the Bodhisattva. Shantideva writes, "We who are like senseless children shrink from suffering, but love its causes." Right? So this is the idea that all human beings long for happiness, they all long to avoid suffering, but we often act in ways that perpetuate our suffering, that create and reinforce our own suffering and the suffering of others. And then the third mark of existence is non-self, the principle that even though we might feel and believe that we have a truly existent self, in fact, when we analyze that self, we find that in fact it doesn't exist, right? That it is just an arising of various causes and conditions. And I like very much Thich Nhat Hanh's notion of interbeing, right? As a concept which captures the way in which the self is really relational and constantly in flux and fluid. So I think that these three marks of existence provide a very useful way of providing a view of reality that is different from the cognitive and existential and cognitive freezing that is associated with conflict situations. More than that, though, of course, Buddhism is not just about providing a description of reality, but it's about finding tools, providing tools for changing our understanding of that reality. And I just have a few minutes left just to mention some of the ways in which you could apply these 3 marks of existence to situations of conflict mediation or conflict resolution. In the Tibetan tradition, we talk about 3 wisdoms. I don't know if this is a term that's found in other Buddhist traditions, but the 3 wisdoms are the 3 ways in which one can come to an understanding of the 3 marks of existence. And the 3 wisdoms are hearing the Buddhist teachings, contemplating the Buddhist teachings, and meditating on the Buddhist teachings. So I think these are ways of thinking about applying our understanding of the marks of existence. And so for one example is for hearing. So here I give the example of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which people literally were given the opportunity at public hearings to talk about their experiences of dukkha, of suffering. And those were broadcast on television and radio. And so just hearing about people suffering enabled the country as a whole to develop a deeper understanding of suffering, of other people suffering, and the realization of their role in causing the suffering of others. The second wisdom is contemplation, and unfortunately I don't have time to talk about this, but there are ways in conflict mediation situations where we can think more deeply about the 3 marks of existence as they apply to that specific conflict. So thinking about the impermanence of that conflict, contemplating my identity, is it real, is it solid? These are some of the ways in which we can contemplate. And then finally, meditation. So meditation is about integrating our understanding in a more full way. And there are various kinds of meditation which would be appropriate to situations of conflict resolution. One is the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which would be a meditation that many of us are familiar with. But in my last minutes, I will just talk about one other, and this is Tonglen. This is a meditation practice which is well known within the Tibetan tradition. And Tonglen meditation is about the exchange of self and other. So in Tonglen meditation, what you do is breathe in the suffering and pain of others, including one's enemies, and breathe out happiness and joy and success. You take in all their suffering on yourself, and you give out all your own happiness to others. And this is a very challenging meditation, and in situations of conflict, you can imagine it to be particularly challenging. But I think that under the right conditions and very carefully done, it can be a very powerful way of creating conditions in which people can begin to shift their fixed, hardened emotional responses towards their enemy, towards others. And so these are just possible ways of thinking about how, as lay Buddhist practitioners, many of us who work in conflict situations can apply the 3 marks of existence to attempting to transform, not only resolve those conflicts, but transform the minds and hearts of people in those conflict situations. Thank you.